The world of live television is unforgiving, where a single, seemingly innocent slip-up can completely unravel a career. In an instant, the years of reputation, hard work, and respect can be reduced to nothing more than a clip replayed over and over on social media, dissected and judged by millions. That night, James Callaway, a veteran TV host known for his sharp questioning, would unknowingly walk into the trap he set for himself. Across from him sat Karoline Leavitt, a rising political star, one of the brightest young conservative voices in America. Their debate, which initially seemed like another standard political discussion, quickly turned into one of the most explosive moments in live television history. As the cameras rolled and the lights of the studio came on, Callaway looked every bit the seasoned professional. He had been a fixture on political talk shows for decades. His reputation for holding politicians accountable had earned him a place among the most respected names in the business. But what few people knew was that even the most experienced TV personalities could be shaken by the pressure of a live broadcast, especially when the stakes were as high as they were that night. Karoline Leavitt, despite her relatively young age, had already become a formidable presence in conservative politics. With a background as a White House press secretary, she had honed a sharp, articulate voice that could stand up to even the toughest critics. That evening's debate had been framed as a simple question: was the media really fair? To the millions watching at home, it seemed like just another political conversation. But for those in the industry, it was clear this particular debate had the potential to shift something much larger. James Callaway had spent years carefully controlling the narrative on his show, The American Spotlight. He was known for pushing his guests, making them uncomfortable with pointed questions that often left them fumbling for a response. Tonight, however, Karoline Leavitt was prepared. She had come to the studio not just to participate in a discussion, but to make her case, to put forward a perspective she believed could no longer be ignored. As the debate began, James opened with his typical polite but firm demeanor. "Karoline, thank you for being here tonight. Our viewers are eager to hear your perspective on an important subject. Is the media truly fair?" His voice was measured, almost rehearsed, but there was an edge to it that suggested he was ready for a challenge. Karoline, without hesitation, responded with a confident smile. "Thank you for having me, James. This is a topic I think we need to address with honesty and openness. In a time when information moves faster than ever, it's crucial that we question whether the media is truly doing its job to report the truth." James nodded, his interest piqued. "Information does move at lightning speed," he said. "But that also forces us to ask a bigger question. Has the media become more than just a source of information? Is it now a tool for those with a vested interest, shaping the narrative to suit certain agendas?" The words hung in the air, and Karoline's expression didn't shift. "The media should be a mirror to the truth, neutral and unbiased," she replied firmly. "But what we're seeing is a manipulation of that mirror, where certain stories are given prominence and others are ignored, depending on who benefits from it." Her voice was calm, controlled, and yet it carried an undeniable force. James smirked slightly, sensing the challenge he had been waiting for. "So you're implying that the media is systematically biased?" he asked, leaning forward, his eyes sharp with the intent to dig deeper. Karoline didn't flinch. "At this point, it's not just an implication, it's an undeniable reality," she said. "The way stories are framed, the language used, and even the choice of which stories make the front page, all of it shapes public perception. And that's not a mistake. It's intentional." James, always one to push the boundaries of debate, raised his eyebrows slightly. "That's an interesting perspective. But what about the way different audiences interpret the news? Could it be that conservatives like yourself are simply searching for bias, even when it's not really there?" He tilted his head, his tones suddenly sharper, suggesting that perhaps this was all a matter of perception, an exaggeration from the right. Karoline paused for just a moment, as if weighing her response carefully. The silence stretched for a second, but it was the kind of silence that spoke volumes. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and unyielding. If bias doesn't exist, James, then why do some stories get buried while others dominate the headlines, even when their significance is equal? Her gaze didn't waver from his. She wasn't backing down. James didn't respond immediately. He shifted in his seat, clearly aware that the conversation had taken a turn. He had expected this kind of pushback, but Karoline's calmness and precision were making it difficult to maintain control. "Can you give me an example?" he asked, his voice laced with curiosity, as if he were simply probing for information. Karoline nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly.
Sure.
Take the case of a politician involved in a major scandal, hardly covered by mainstream outlets, despite its significance. Meanwhile, a minor incident involving a conservative politician is blown up, examined from every angle for weeks. Is that fairness? James pressed his lips together. This wasn't the direction he had intended. The conversation had moved from theory to real-world examples, and Karoline had just made a powerful case. He knew he needed to pivot. "I see your point," he said, but his tone began to take on a more defensive edge. "But wouldn't you agree that conservative media does the same thing? They curate their coverage, crafting narratives that fit their own agenda. Isn't that where the real problem lies?" Karoline didn't blink. "I don't deny that some conservative outlets are biased," she said. "But the key difference is that they don't pretend to be neutral. They don't claim to be objective truth-tellers. Mainstream media, however, has positioned itself as the bastion of objectivity while pushing its own agenda behind the scenes." James paused, considering her words. His expression darkened slightly. He had just been outmaneuvered in a way he hadn't expected. But instead of retreating, he pressed on, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "So, you're suggesting that all mainstream media outlets have a political agenda?" Karoline offered a small, knowing smile. "I don't need to say it, James," she replied. "Just look at how the news is presented, the headlines, the images, the stories they choose to highlight, and the ones they bury. It's all intentional." The room fell silent for a beat, the weight of her words settling in. James knew the battle was no longer just about political ideologies. It was about something far bigger, the way the media wielded its power and the responsibility it had to maintain credibility. He had spent decades asking tough questions, but now, for the first time, he found himself on the receiving end of a tough answer. But James wasn't finished. He leaned forward again, his voice taking on a sharper tone. "But Karoline, don't conservatives do the same thing? They have their own media outlets, their own platforms, their own narratives. Don't you think that's part of the problem?" Karoline didn't hesitate. "There's a major difference, James. Conservative outlets might be biased, but they don't control the entire system. They don't control the narrative the way mainstream media does. And that's what influences millions of people every single day." James's face hardened, his frustration starting to show. "So, what you're saying is that conservatives are being silenced?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Karoline took a deep breath, her voice unwavering. "I'm not saying we're silenced, James. I'm saying that the system is rigged. There's a structure in place that shapes public opinion, that controls what information is disseminated, and punishes anyone who dares to challenge it." James's eyes narrowed. He wasn't going to let this slide. "You're describing a conspiracy, Karoline," he said, his voice carrying an edge of disbelief. Karoline met his gaze, without flinching. "Not a conspiracy, just reality." The tension in the room escalated. The studio had transformed from a place of political debate to an intellectual battlefield. And in the middle of it all, James Callaway, a veteran TV host who had made a career out of asking tough questions, had just crossed the line. In an effort to regain control, James let out a low, controlled chuckle. But his next words would mark the beginning of the end of his career. "All right, Karoline," James said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let's cut to the chase. You conservatives always talk about media bias, about how you're being treated unfairly. But tell me this, who controls the narrative? who really holds the power here? Karoline didn't flinch. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "People like me?" she asked, her voice steady but cutting. James hesitated, realizing the weight of what he had just said. But it was too late to back down. He pressed on. "You know exactly what I mean. Conservatives. The ones who complain about being silenced when, in reality, they're the ones who control the conversation." Karoline's gaze didn't falter. She asked, her voice soft but sharp, "Would you care to clarify what you mean by that?" The moment those words left her mouth, everything changed. The studio, the producers in the control room, and the viewers at home all held their breath. James Callaway had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He had crossed a line that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. The words that followed would haunt him for the rest of his life. He exhaled sharply, his frustration creeping into his voice. I meant that if conservatives stopped fixating on the idea that they're being silenced, maybe they'd have more real influence in society." Karoline didn't need to say anything. She just looked at him, her gaze calm and unwavering. The damage was done. The clip of their exchange would go viral within minutes, and James Callaway's career would be reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale. The rest of the night was a blur, a series of final questions that no longer mattered. By the next morning, the fallout was swift and unforgiving. Social media erupted. Hashtags like #FireJamesCallaway spread like wildfire. Outrage poured in from every corner of the internet, demanding that Callaway be held accountable for his words. Sponsors began pulling their advertisements, and the network, caught in the crossfire, found itself scrambling to manage the crisis. And then came the statement that would seal James Callaway's fate. Effective immediately, James Callaway is no longer employed by this network. The longtime host, whose voice had shaped public discourse for decades, was gone. And Karoline Leavitt, who had sat across from him, poised and unflinching, was now more than just a rising star. She had become a symbol, a representation of the growing discontent with mainstream media. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence spoke louder than any words ever could. But as the world reacted, the story didn't end there. James Callaway, the man who had been silenced by a single moment, would not disappear quietly. He had a voice, and he would make sure the world heard it.